The land stretched wide under the burning western sun, a place where silence weighed heavy, and the wind carried more secrets than words ever could. Out there, beyond the fences of polished rails and the creak of weathered barns, men carved out their lives with sweat and grit, and women bore it all with quiet endurance. It was a country of hard soil and harder hearts. And among them stood one man whose name carried weight from the riverbanks to the far ridges of the valley. He was the wealthy rancher, a man known for his iron will, his broad spread of cattle, and the tragic tale that shadowed his every step. They said he buried his bride with his own hands. Some whispered it was grief that broke him. Others swore it was guilt. But no one truly knew what passed in the hush of that gray morning when the church bell tolled for her. His wealth could buy cattle, land, and men's loyalty, but not the one thing that mattered most. Death had taken her swiftly, leaving him hollow, a man who rode his fields as though chasing ghosts. He had everything a rancher could ever want, yet he carried himself like a man stripped bare of all but sorrow. The townfolk kept their distance. They respected him, feared him, even pitied him, but none dared approach too close. A man with a wound that deep carried a storm inside, and no one wanted to stand in its path. The ranch hands did their work in silence, glancing only when necessary, while the neighbors offered condolences from afar, but never tarried long. At night, the glow from his house stood alone against the vast dark, a beacon and a warning both. The wealthy rancher was a man apart, bound not to the living but to the memory of the one he had lost. Yet life in the old American West had a way of moving on, whether a heart was ready for it or not. Wagons still rattled down the dusty street, children still played by the water trough, and trade still passed through the little town. It was there, among the hum of ordinary days, that she appeared, not with the grace of wealth or the polished airs of society, but with the steady hand and quiet patience of one who worked with thread and cloth. She was the seamstress, a woman whose needle stitched more than garments, stitched stories, hopes. In the torn fabric of those too poor to replace what they had, she lived in a modest room above the old shop, where the light spilled across bolts of faded fabric and the steady rhythm of her sewing filled the silence. People brought her their worn shirts, their children's dresses, their wedding veils when times were good, and their mourning clothes when times were not. Her skill was known, but her presence was quiet, almost unnoticed in a town that busied itself with louder matters. Yet beneath her hands, cloth became whole again. And perhaps she understood better than most that mending was not only for fabric but for souls. The first time she saw him, he was crossing the street on horseback, the sun catching the hard lines of his face, his eyes set far beyond the horizon. Dust trailed behind him as though even the earth bent to his passing. She had heard the stories, of course everyone had, but the man himself seemed heavier than the words. Something in his silence spoke louder than any tale could. And though she lowered her gaze as he passed, something inside her stirred, like a thread pulled taut but not yet broken. Days stretched into weeks, and their paths crossed more often, though never by design. She saw him at the blacksmith's, his broad shoulders hunched, as if the weight of grief rode him heavier than any saddle. She saw him at the mercantile, where he exchanged coins without a word, his voice low and gravelly, like earth turned by a shovel. She even saw him once by the river, where he sat alone, staring at the water as though it might carry away the memories he could not. And each time, though no words passed between them, she felt the pull of something unspoken, a thread that tied her gaze to his. However fleetingly, the town whispered again. Whispers were the lifeblood of such places, after all. They said the seamstress had looked too long at the rancher. They said perhaps she was foolish, or worse, bold enough to imagine what could never be. But she knew nothing of such talk. All she knew was the heaviness in his eyes, the silence in his voice, and the sense that a man who had buried his bride was living half in the earth himself. It was on an evening when the sky burned red over the horizon that their paths finally crossed in earnest. She had lingered at her shop door, folding a piece of cloth when the sound of hooves drew near. He dismounted with the slow precision of a man carrying more years than he had lived. And for a moment he simply stood, his shadow falling across her steps. She looked up, unsure whether to speak or step aside, when his voice low and rough broke the silence. "Can you mend this?" he asked, holding out a torn sleeve, the fabric frayed as though it had caught on barbed wire. His eyes did not meet hers, but his hand trembled just enough to betray what words never would. She nodded, her throat tight, and took the fabric from him. Their hands brushed, and though the touch was fleeting, it was enough to spark something neither could name as she worked on the sleeve that night. The needle slipping through the cloth with quiet precision. She thought not of the tear itself, but of the man who had carried it. She wondered what scars he bore beneath the fabric, what wounds no seamstress could ever mend. And for the first time, she felt the weight of her own heartbeat, steady and insistent, as though reminding her that even sorrow had a rhythm waiting to be stitched into something new. The next morning, when she returned the garment, his eyes lingered on her longer than before. Not enough to speak, not enough to break the silence that hung between them, but enough to change it. And in that small change lay the beginning of something neither had sought, but both felt. The wealthy rancher who had buried his bride with the earth, and the seamstress who mended what was broken, now found themselves bound by a quiet thread neither could ignore, but the West was not kind to those who hoped to openly. Shadows lingered on the horizon, and storms gathered where none expected. As the rancher stood in her doorway, sleeve in hand, and as she dared meet his gaze for the first time without lowering her eyes, something unseen shifted in the world around them. The story of grief and mending had only begun, and neither knew what price the future would demand for the chance to be whole again. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the street, and the rancher glanced back at his horse before looking at her once more. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he turned, mounted, and rode off into the fading light, leaving her with the sleeve she had mended and a heart she could no longer keep still. And in that silence, between the sound of hooves fading and the echo of her own breath, the seamstress understood something was coming. And when it did, nothing in that quiet town, nor in the life of the wealthy rancher, would remain the same. The night after he rode away, the seamstress sat by her window with the garment still folded in her lap. The stitching was strong, straight as any line she had ever made, but her thoughts were not steady. The weight of his silence lingered with her, heavier than the cloth itself. She had mended countless shirts, coats, and dresses for townsfolk, but this was different. The fabric seemed to carry the ache of his heart. In her hands it felt as if she had touched something far more fragile than cloth. She wondered why her chest tightened at the thought of him, why her breath caught when she recalled the roughness of his voice. She tried to brush it aside. The quiet of her room offered no escape from her own thoughts. The wealthy rancher, meanwhile, rode through his land as the night settled in. The cattle moved restlessly in the distance, their shadows stretching long in the pale moonlight. He had built everything a man could hope for: wide-open pastures, herds thick enough to feed a county, and a home large enough to withstand the wild winds of winter. Yet all of it stood empty for him. The echo of his bride's laughter no longer filled the house. Her touch no longer softened the edges of his world. When she had gone, he buried her beneath the old cottonwood near the chapel, the one place where the earth seemed willing to hold her memory. Since that day he had lived like a man half alive, tending to cattle and land but never to himself. He had not planned to step into the seamstress's shop. It was the rip in his sleeve that had carried him there. But when her eyes met his, something unsettled him in a way he had not felt since before his loss. He had told himself it was nothing, just a passing glance, but the memory returned with each stride of his horse. He did not want to remember the way her gaze had held his, or the way her hands had brushed his own, but he could not stop himself. He rode on, his jaw tight, unwilling to admit that the smallest of things, a stitch in cloth, a touch of a hand, had stirred something in him. The seamstress had her own shadows. Few in town knew her full story, though they spoke of her with kind regard. She had arrived years before, carrying little more than a trunk and her sewing tools. Her past was a closed book, and she kept it that way, working from dawn until late into the evening. Folks respected her skill, but she remained apart, as if some part of her had been left behind elsewhere. She knew what it was to lose, though she never spoke of it. She knew the sound of emptiness and the feel of loneliness pressing in like winter's chill. Perhaps that was why, when she looked at the rancher, She saw not just a man of wealth and land, but a soul carrying a burden she recognized too well. As the weeks passed, the town noticed the smallest of things. He came by her shop more than once, each time with another garment that needed mending. Sometimes it was a coat, sometimes a shirt, once even a saddle blanket. None of these things were beyond repair by the hands of his own men, yet he brought them to her. She did not question it, nor did she speak of it. She simply took the items, mended them with care, and returned them. Their conversations were short, a little more than a word here or there. But in the quiet exchanges something began to grow, unseen but deeply felt. Still the whispers continued. Some said the rancher sought to replace his bride, others claimed the seamstress was too plain for a man of his standing. The town was small, and its words traveled fast. Yet neither of them gave voice to such things. The rancher carried himself with the same distance as always, and the seamstress continued her work with calm patience. But behind closed doors, both thought of the other more than they wished to admit. The land itself seemed to echo their unease. Storm clouds gathered more often that season, rolling over the hills with thunder that shook the windows. Cattle grew restless, fences broke beneath sudden winds, and the men working the ranch spoke in hushed tones of troubles ahead. The wealthy rancher carried the weight of it all, but his mind wandered more than before. While he checked the herds or rode the ridges, he thought of her small shop, the steady sound of her needle, and the calm in her eyes. One evening, as dusk painted the sky, he found himself stopping before her door again. This time, he had no garment in need of repair. He stood there a long while, his hand hovering near the latch, before he finally turned away. He could not bring himself to cross that line. To do so felt like a betrayal, as though his bride's memory would be swept aside by the smallest act of seeking comfort elsewhere. Yet as he mounted his horse, he caught a glimpse of her at the window, her figure outlined by lamplight. She did not move, but he knew she had seen him. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before he urged his horse forward, disappearing into the deepening night. Inside, the seamstress pressed a hand to the fabric she had been working on, her fingers trembling. She had seen him pause, had seen the conflict in his posture, and though he had ridden away, she knew he would return. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. She did not know why she was so certain, only that something unspoken tied them both. The following days brought new troubles. A rival rancher had been pressing against the wealthy rancher's borders, sending his men to test fences and graze cattle where they did not belong. It was an old feud, one that had simmered for years, but now it grew hotter. The men spoke of disputes turning violent. The wealthy rancher found himself pulled between duty to his land and the growing storm within his own heart. He could not show weakness, not to his enemies, not to his men, yet the weight of loneliness made him less steady than he once was. The seamstress heard the talk too. Though she had no part in the affairs of cattle or land, still she worried in silence, stitching late into the night while her thoughts strayed to him. She told herself it was foolish, that his world was not hers, but her heart paid no heed to such reasoning. Each thread she pulled seemed to carry his name, and each garment she mended seemed to prepare her for something she could not yet see. One afternoon, when the sun was sharp and the air dry with dust, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find not the rancher himself, but one of his men. He carried a coat, torn and dirt-stained, and asked her to mend it quickly. She took it without question, but as she laid it across her table, her hands froze. The coat bore the rancher's initials inside the lining, and the tear was not from barbed wire or work-it, was from a blade. Her breath caught. For the first time, fear pressed in around her. Something had happened, something the men would not speak of, and the coat in her hands was proof of it. She stitched in silence, each pull of the needle heavy with worry, her thoughts circling like restless horses. When she returned the coat, the man offered no explanation, only a curt nod before riding away. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was safe, if he would come again, if the storms outside and the storms within his world would carry him too far from her. She told herself she had no place in his life, no claim to his heart, yet the truth settled deep inside her. She wanted him to return, wanted to see him at her door once more. even if only for a torn sleeve or a few quiet words. And somewhere across the darkened land, the wealthy rancher sat alone in his house, the mended coat beside him, the memory of the seamstress's steady hands haunting him more than the threat of any rival. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether it would be peace, war, or something else entirely, but he knew one thing with certainty. His heart, broken and buried with his bride, had begun to stir once more. And it was not the land or the cattle that had done it. It was her. The days that followed, pressed down heavy on both the ranch and the town. Word spread of cattle missing, fences cut in the night, and riders spotted too close to borders that were long understood but seldom crossed. The wealthy rancher knew the signs. Trouble was brewing, and it was no small matter of lost livestock. It was a challenge, plain and simple. And men in the West did not back away from such things without blood or bone to prove their claim. He had lived through feuds before, but this one carried a sharper edge. His men were uneasy, whispers circling about what might come, and the weight of leadership rested square on his shoulders. He carried that weight like he carried everything. Silent and heavy, showing no crack to those who looked to him for strength. But when night fell and the house grew quiet, he would sit with the mended coat beside him, his fingers brushing the stitching. It was a strange comfort, the thought that someone's hands had cared enough to steady what was torn. The seamstress had done more than mend fabric. She had left her mark on him, one that gnawed at the edges of his grief. He told himself it was weakness to think of her, to let her face come between him and his duty, yet still he did. The seamstress, too, felt the change. Her work kept her busy, but her mind wandered off into the coat she had stitched and the cut that spoke of danger. She asked no questions, though her heart wanted answers. She only listened. And in the listening, she caught fragments of talk that drifted through her shop. Men warning of disputes at the northern ridge. Women fretting about their husbands riding out late. Children repeating overheard words like ambush and raid. She kept her worry to herself, but it weighed heavy as she bent over her sewing late into the night. There were others who watched the rancher's life with interest, too. The rival rancher, a man known for sharp dealings and sharper temper, had long envied the spread of land that reached from river to ridge. His cattle grazed thin ground, his men restless with hunger for more. To him, the wealthy rancher was not just a neighbor, but an obstacle. A wall standing between him and the fortune he believed should be his. And though he never stepped into the seamstress's shop, word reached him of the quiet woman who had caught the rancher's attention. He did not take kindly to weakness, and in his mind, a man torn between grief and some new softness was a man easier to break. The town itself became a stage, where the tension played out. At the saloon, voices rose louder, arguments sparking between men loyal to one side or the other. At the church, prayers lingered longer, as wives whispered of the dangers waiting on the horizon. Even the blacksmith, whose hands were always busy, paused in his work to listen when riders passed with hurried steps and guarded eyes. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one knew how far it would reach. Amid this rising storm, the seamstress tried to keep her world steady. She stitched dresses for children, patched work shirts for tired men, and sewed veils for bride-to-be, though her own heart carried a weight no needle could lift. Each time the rancher appeared at her door, her breath caught. Sometimes he brought garments torn in ways that told their own stories. Sometimes he brought nothing at all, only standing there as if searching for words he could not speak. Their exchanges were brief, but their silence held more than most conversations ever did. One evening he lingered longer than usual. She was bent over a hem when she felt his presence in the doorway. Looking up, she found him watching her, his hat in his hands, his eyes carrying that familiar storm. He did not speak at first, and she did not press him. Finally, his voice broke the quiet. "You ever think about leaving this town?" he asked, low and rough, her fingers stilled on the fabric. She had thought of it long ago, but she had no place to go and no reason to leave. Now, with his gaze heavy on her, the thought came alive in a way that startled her. She shook her head gently. "This is where I belong," she said softly, though her heart beat faster than her words led on. He nodded, as though he had expected no other answer. Still, there was something in the way he looked at her, something that spoke of a longing he could not name. Before she could say more, he placed the hat back on his head, murmured a quiet farewell, and stepped into the night, leaving her with questions that tugged at her heart long after he was gone. Trouble only deepened after that. Men loyal to the rival rancher pushed harder, riding closer, driving cattle across lines that were not theirs. The wealthy rancher's men rode out to meet them, skirmishes sparking in the dust, but always ending with more anger than blood. Each day the tension grew. Each night the fear settled deeper. The seamstress heard it all, though no one spoke directly to her. She saw it in the faces of the women who brought her clothes, in the silence of the men who passed by her window, in the way the rancher himself seemed pulled tighter each time she saw him. One night she woke to shouting in the street. Pulling her shawl tight, she peered from her window to see riders tearing through town, their torches lighting the dark. They did not stop at her shop, but the sight of them shook her to her core. She lay awake until morning, her needle idle for the first time in years, her thoughts circling the same truth. She was no longer only an observer. Whether she wished it or not, she was tied to what was coming. Meanwhile, the rancher faced his own torment. His men looked to him for orders. His land demanded his protection. Yet his thoughts strayed to her more often than he dared admit. He feared for her, though he had no right to claim her safety as his concern. He wanted to shield her from what was stirring, yet he knew that by caring for her, he was placing her in danger. The rival rancher would see her as a weakness, a thread to pull until the whole cloth of his world unraveled. The conflict reached deeper than land or cattle. It was a fight of pride, of legacy, of hearts scarred by loss and hardened by survival. And in the middle of it, quietly but firmly, the seamstress became a piece of the story neither man could ignore. One afternoon, a stranger came to her shop. He was tall, with a worn coat and eyes that did not linger on her work but on her face. He asked for nothing to be mended, only stood in her doorway with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You do fine work," he said slowly. "Real fine. My employer speaks highly of you." She felt the chill in his words. He was no customer. He was a message, a warning wrapped in politeness. She nodded, keeping her voice steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. When he left, the air felt colder, and she knew her world had shifted. She was no longer invisible. That night, as she stitched by lamplight, the sound of hooves thundered past her window, followed by voices raised in anger. She set her needle down and pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer she had not spoken in years. The conflict was no longer at the edge of her world. It was here, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed more than land and cattle. Out on the ranch, the wealthy rancher stood by the fence line, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He felt the storm gathering, both in the land and within himself. He had buried his bride with his own hands, had sworn never to open his heart again. Yet now the seamstress haunted him more than the memories of his grief. He wanted her safe, but to keep her safe, he would have to fight harder than he had ever fought before. The wind carried dust across the fields, and the sound of distant riders drifted closer. The time for silence was ending, and both the rancher and the seamstress knew it. What neither could know was just how deeply the conflict would bind them, or what it would demand of their hearts before it was through. The air over the valley grew heavier as the days shortened, carrying the feeling of something waiting to break. Dust clung to the wind, and the cattle were restless, as if they too sensed the storm building. The wealthy rancher rode his land more than ever, his eyes sharp on the horizon, his hand never far from the revolver at his side. He knew his rival would not wait much longer. Every move, every torn fence, every missing head of cattle was meant to test his patience, to push him into a fight before he was ready. Yet the greatest test of all was not out on the ridges or in the canyons. It was in the town, in the small shop where the seamstress bent over her work each night with a lamp burning late. He tried to stay away, but he found himself drawn back to her door again and again. Sometimes he carried a coat or shirt that needed mending, though he hardly cared about the garment. Other times he brought nothing at all, only standing there in silence while she looked up from her work, her eyes calm in a way that unsettled him. He never stayed long, but each time he left, the ache in his chest was sharper. He had sworn to never let another woman touch his heart after burying his bride. Yet the seamstress's quiet strength reached places inside him he thought had been laid to rest with the coffin. The seamstress felt the same pull. She told herself she was foolish for it, yet she could not deny what her heart knew. She had lived a quiet life, one built on the rhythm of a needle and thread. But ever since the rancher had stood in her doorway with that torn sleeve, her world no longer felt steady. She thought of him often, even as she stitched garments for others. She worried for him, knowing the dangers gathering beyond the town. And though she had no place in his world of land and cattle, she could not shake the feeling that their lives were now tied together. The rival rancher's men had grown bolder. They rode into town with sharp eyes and sharp words, making their presence known. Some stopped by her shop, not for her work, but to leave her unsettled with lingering stares or sly remarks. One afternoon, a man laid his hand flat on her counter and leaned in close. "A woman with skills like yours could be useful in more ways than one," he said with a smile that carried no kindness. She forced herself to meet his eyes, her voice steady as she told him to leave. He did, but not before chuckling under his breath, as if he knew something she did not. When the rancher heard of this, his fury was sharper than he allowed anyone to see. He confronted his foreman that night by the fire, his voice low but burning with anger. "They set foot near her again, I'll see to it myself," he warned. The foreman nodded, but the rancher knew this was not something easily solved. His rival had found the one weakness he had tried to bury with his, fried the part of him still capable of care. As autumn deepened, the rancher's enemies pressed harder. One night, shots rang out near the northern pasture, and one of his men returned wounded, his arm grazed by a bullet. Another time, a barn caught fire, the flames devouring the haystack before they could be put out. Each act was meant to provoke, to force his hand. The rancher did not bend, but each blow chipped at the edges of his control. His men grew restless, demanding action, while his own heart pulled in two directions: to protect his land, and to protect the woman whose quiet presence had begun to mean more than he could admit. The seamstress noticed the change in him. When he came to her shop, his shoulders seemed heavier, his eyes darker. One evening, she found herself reaching out, her hand brushing his sleeve as she handed back a mended coat. For a moment, he did not move, his gaze locked on hers. Then he pulled away, his jaw tight. "You don't know what you're risking," he said, his voice rough, before turning to leave. She watched him go, her heart pounding, knowing his warning was true, but unwilling to let it keep her from caring. That same night, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her window. Holding her breath, she peered through the curtain and saw two figures standing in the street, their heads tilted toward her shop. She could not make out their faces, but she felt their eyes on her. When she lit her lamp, they moved away slowly, disappearing into the shadows. She did not sleep again until dawn, her needle lying untouched on the table. The tension spread through the town like wildfire. The saloon was filled with angry talk, men choosing sides, while the church pews filled with women praying for peace. The blacksmith shook his head as he hammered at his forge, muttering that no good could come of pride in land. Yet beneath it all, the sense grew stronger that the coming fight would not be kept to the hills. It would spill into the streets, and everyone would pay the price. The rival rancher played his hand with patience. He sent men to watch, to whisper, to unsettle. He knew his opponent was a man of honor, one who would not strike without cause. But he also knew that every man had a breaking point, and he had seen the way the wealthy rancher's eyes followed the seamstress, the way she had become a quiet fixture in his world. She was not just a woman with a needle. She was a thread holding together a man who might otherwise unravel. To pull that thread would be to bring the whole cloth down. The rancher sensed it, though he never spoke of it. Each time he rode past her shop, his hand tightened on the reins, torn between stopping and staying away. He wanted to keep her safe by keeping his distance, but he could not. The pull was too strong, the silence between them too full of meaning. When he saw her at the market one morning, her basket filled with cloth and thread, he found himself walking beside her, their steps slow in the dust. He did not speak much, only a few words about the weather, the cattle, the season ahead. Yet she felt the weight of his presence like a promise unspoken. As winter's edge drew near, the attacks grew sharper. One of his men was beaten and left near the river, another disappeared altogether. The rancher knew his rival was pushing him toward a choice. If he did nothing, he would lose not only land but respect. If he struck, he risked open war. And through it all, the thought of the seamstress gnawed at him, for he knew she was no longer untouched by the feud. She had been marked by it the moment his enemies saw how he looked at her. The night before the first snow, a rider came hard to his door, his horse lathered with sweat. "They've taken someone," the man gasped. The rancher's blood ran cold before the name was even spoken. He knew. He had known it would come to this. Far across town, in the dim light of her shop, the seamstress sat with her work untouched. The silence broken by the sound of boots outside. She turned slowly, her breath catching as the door swung open. Figures filled the doorway, their faces shadowed, their voices low and steady. She did not cry out, though her heart thundered. She knew this was no ordinary visit. This was the storm arriving at her very door. The rancher stood on his porch, the night air cutting sharp as the rider's words echoed in his ears. His hands clenched at his sides, his heart torn between fury and fear. The feud had finally found its way to the one place he could not afford to lose. He knew the rival had forced his hand at last, dragging the fight from the open pastures into the depths of his very soul. The lamps in the distance flickered. The land silent but for the restless cry of cattle and the sound of hooves gathering on the horizon. The time for waiting had ended. The moment of reckoning was upon him, and with it, the fate of the seamstress whose quiet strength had already mended more of him than he had ever intended to give. The night carried a weight heavier than any storm. The silence broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The rancher's men gathered behind him, their eyes lit by the glow of lanterns, waiting for his word. Yet his mind was not on the men or the cattle. It was on her, the seamstress whose door had been dark when he last rode through town. He felt the pull of duty on both sides, his land and his people, but also the one woman who had stitched her way into the cracks of his broken heart. He rode hard across the valley, each hoofbeat striking in time with the fury inside him. He did not shout, he did not curse, but the fire in his eyes told his men to follow. They knew this was no longer about fences or cattle. This was personal, and men are most dangerous when their hearts are on the line at the rival ranch. Lanterns flared like beacons, shadows moving quick across the yard. She was there, her hands bound, seated on the porch steps as if set on display. The rival rancher stood nearby, calm as if waiting for the inevitable. He tipped his hat when the wealthy rancher approached, his smile sharp in the lamplight. "You took what was mine once," he said, his voice low but steady. "Land, water, respect. Now I'll take what's yours. It seems fair." The seamstress lifted her head, her eyes finding the man who had come for her. She did not cry out. She did not plead. She simply met his gaze, and in that silent exchange, he felt all the strength she had carried through each lonely night, all the quiet courage that had drawn him without his permission. The air tightened, both sides waiting for the first move. It was not a battle of guns at first, but a battle of wills. Two men standing face to face with years of bitterness between them. The wealthy rancher spoke, his words sharp and measured. "You've burned my barns, cut my fences, stolen from my herds, but you will not take her." His hand rested near his revolver, his body still, every muscle taut. The rival sneered, gesturing to the men at his back. "One man against many. You'll die for her, and the land will still be mine." But the rancher's men rode in behind him, forming a line, their lanterns casting long shadows across the yard. Their loyalty had not wavered, not through fire, not through blood. The rival's confidence faltered, though his pride held him upright. In that pause, the seamstress whispered his name, so soft only he could hear. It was enough. The fight broke like thunder. Shots rang across the yard, horses reared, and men dove for cover. Smoke clouded the air as the sound of steel and gunfire filled the night. The rancher moved with purpose, his eyes never straying from the porch where she sat. He fought not for pride, but for her, each step driving him closer. The rival met him in the open, revolver drawn, their eyes locking in the chaos. They circled each other, the feud of years burning in their glares. The rival fired first, the shot grazing the rancher's arm. Pain flared, but he pressed forward, tackling him to the ground. The struggle was brutal, fists and fury colliding, each man refusing to yield. Around them, the fight raged, but for the rancher. The world narrowed to the man who had threatened everything he had left. With one final strike, he brought the rival down, the revolver skidding across the dirt. He stood over him, chest heaving, blood running from his arm, his shadow cast long by the firelight. The rival lay beaten, his pride shattered more than his body. The rancher did not pull the trigger. He simply looked at him with a fury that needed no words. Mercy, in that moment, was its own weapon. The rival's men, seeing their leader fallen, dropped their weapons. Some fled into the darkness, others raised their hands. The fight drained from the yard as quickly as it had begun, leaving only smoke, silence, and the moans of the wounded. The rancher turned then, his steps heavy but sure, until he stood before her. He cut the ropes from her wrists, his hands trembling though he tried to steady them. She rose slowly, her eyes shining in the lamplight. And for the first time, he allowed himself to meet them without turning away. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough. She touched his wounded arm, her hand gentle, and shook her head. "No," she whispered, "we're safe now." Those words struck deeper than any bullet, for they carried not only relief, but the truth he had long denied. He had not saved her alone. She had saved him too, pulling him back from the life of a man buried with his grief. In her, he found more than comfort, he found the reason to keep living. The days that followed brought slow healing. The rival rancher was driven out, his men scattered. The valley grew quiet again, the cattle grazing without disturbance, the fences mended. The townsfolk spoke of the fight for weeks, their stories twisting and turning. But all agreed on one thing. The wealthy rancher had not fought for pride, but for love. The seamstress returned to her shop, though the lamp in her window no longer burned alone. Often, as she stitched, he sat nearby, his presence steady, the silence between them filled not with distance, but with peace. He did not rush her, nor she him. What grew between them did so naturally, like spring grass after a long winter and time. The rancher found himself laughing again, the sound surprising even him. He rode his land with a lighter heart, not because the burdens had vanished, but because he no longer carried them alone. She stitched his coats, but she also stitched his spirit, mending the places life had torn. And he, in return, gave her the protection and companionship she had never dared to hope for. The valley itself seemed to breathe easier. The saloon grew quieter, the church pews filled with songs of thanks, and children played in the dust without fear of shadows on the horizon. Life had not become perfect, but it had become steady, and in the Old West, that was more than enough. At night, when the sun dipped low and the stars stretched wide, he often stood on the porch of her shop, watching the light spill from within. He thought of the long road that had brought him there, grief that had once held him prisoner, and the fight that had nearly cost them everything. Then he would step inside, the scent of cloth and lamp oil familiar now, and sit across from her as she worked. She would glance up, smile softly, and in that simple moment, he knew the truth. The feud had been about land, cattle, and power, but in the end, it had revealed something greater. Love could be quiet, steady, and stronger than any gun drawn in anger. It did not come in a rush or a blaze. It came in the gentle strength of a woman with needle and thread, and in the heart of a man who finally chose to let go of the past. And so, the story of the wealthy rancher and the seamstress settled into the fabric of the town, spoken in hushed tones over coffee, and shared with a smile by those who had seen it unfold. For in a land where storms rose fast and enemies struck hard, their tales stood as proof that even in the harshest places, love could take root, endure, and mend what once seemed beyond repair.